My dear brothers and sisters, this morning the gospel challenges us with this obscure saying of Jesus. He says, "The lamp of the body is the eye. If your eye is sound, your whole body will be filled with light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be in darkness. And if the light in you is darkness, how great will the darkness be?" We could sit there and scratch our heads and maybe lose a little bit more hair asking Jesus, what do you mean by that? The lamp of the body is the eye. What does that mean? It means that the way we see, the way we perceive, can sometimes change the outcome of our lives, for good or for bad. If we have the right perception from God, we see Him acting in our lives. We see what He values. We see what's important to Him. We see what isn't important to Him. If, however, our eye is not sound, if our perception is off, the opposite is true. We don't see how God sees things. We live in a bit of darkness. And then Jesus says this key word. He says, if the light in you is darkness, how great will the darkness be? Meaning, if your eye is off, if your perception is off, and yet you think your perception is right, then you've convinced yourself to live in darkness, and nobody can convince you otherwise. He uses this sometimes, Jesus, to speak to people like some of the Pharisees sometimes, who thought that they had everything right, but in fact they didn't. We see this same kind of thing about how the things we might think are important are not actually that important. St. Paul mentions this in the first reading that we heard. Some of the things that we might glory in, we could change up these words. Some people might say that they might boast in not being necessarily Hebrew or son of Benjamin, but, being Italian or being Irish or being German. Name whatever it is, in terms of thinking that the most important thing, if we think that the most important thing is where we come from or our heritage in that regard, as important as it is, it's not as important as the heavenly things. St. Paul makes it also clear too, one might think that something was wrong with St. Paul, the fact that he's going through so many trials that he mentions again and again. He says, how many times I had been beaten or stoned or shipwrecked or on these different dangers, If we thought that the Christian life meant always having it easy, well, we've got another thing coming, St. Paul says. So we want to be sure that we are seeing our lives the way God sees things, and the eyes of providence are different than what we think. Here we heard right before the gospel, blessed are the poor in spirit, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. What he means by that is, blessed are those who know they need help. Because Jesus doesn't ask us to be strong. He doesn't ask us to figure it out. He doesn't ask us to be smart enough. He asks us to surrender our lives to Him so that He can show us that the little things to Him, the things that seem weak in the eyes of the world, are actually great to Him. Today we celebrate St. Aloysius Gonzaga, who was a Jesuit, and yet his life, basically, he was a young Jesuit and he died young. And yet, at the same time, though people might say, oh, what a waste of a life, how short did he live, and he didn't do much because he was ill, and yet, in the eyes of the Lord, his life was very valuable. He was a model to the Jesuits of holiness of life. And so we want to, brothers and sisters, make sure that we are letting the Lord be the one to heal our eyes. We have very good news today. The guy who healed people who were blind is coming to us today in the Eucharist, Jesus Christ, in His body, blood, soul, and divinity. It's not a different Jesus, it's the same Jesus. He's the one who can heal our blindness, but we have to recognize that we're blind at times. We have to be willing to admit that. and willing to say, like the blind Bartimaeus who was sitting on the road to Jericho, we must be willing to say to Jesus, Master, I want to see. And the good news is this: we see that the Holy Spirit himself gives us gifts, but we have to be willing to accept them. Knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. Holy Spirit also helps us to see God's movements, to see what God is doing in our lives, and to, in a way, surrender to those movements. See, as North Americans, as Americans, we don't like the idea that we have to somehow be passive. But in faith, there is this active surrendering to what God is doing, this active saying yes to the Lord, to his work in our lives. Pope Francis recently, last year, published the exhortation Gaudete et Exultate, and he mentioned two areas that we need to look at where we sometimes think that these are the things that are important when they're not actually the gospel. The one is the idea that we can somehow will ourselves to be holy if we just try harder. The other is if we just know more. If we just know more about the faith, that somehow we'll become holy. So the Pope is reminding us there's this mystery that we're surrendering to, the mystery of Jesus active in our lives, the mystery of Jesus who's the one who brings about our faith and even inspires us to the virtues. So we ask the Lord today, this morning, to give us that grace of a healing of our eyes, and also to have the grace of humility to recognize, Lord, I don't see everything perfectly, but I'm willing for you to heal me. I'm willing for you to be the one to show me how things really are.